U.S. President Joe Biden is trying to oust Prime Minister Netanyahu from office. And he's not alone. I'll have details on Biden's unseen partners coming up on In Focus. Earlier this week, we were all pretty stunned to see Senator Chuck Schumer, the highest level Jewish politician in the United States, the Senate Majority Leader, call for Prime Minister Netanyahu's ouster from power. I think it's worth looking for a second at what Senator Schumer said in a little bit of detail. So let's just go for a second to what he said.
In order to achieve a two-state solution, the reality is that things must change. Right now, there are four major obstacles standing in the way of two states. And until they are removed from the equation, there will never be peace in Israel and Gaza and the West Bank. The four major obstacles are Hamas and the Palestinians who support and tolerate their evil ways, radical right-wing Israelis in government and society, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The fourth major obstacle to peace is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has all too frequently bowed to the demands of extremists like Ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and the settlers in the West Bank. I also believe Prime Minister Netanyahu has lost his way by allowing his political survival to take the precedence over the best interests of Israel. He has put himself in coalition with far-right extremists like Ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, and as a result, he has been too willing to tolerate the civilian toll in Gaza, which is pushing support for Israel worldwide to historic lows. Israel cannot survive if it becomes a pariah. Prime Minister Netanyahu has also weakened Israel's political and moral fabric through his attempts to co-opt the judiciary, and he has shown zero interest in doing the courageous and visionary work required to pave the way for peace, even before this present conflict. As a lifelong supporter of Israel, it has become clear to me the Netanyahu coalition no longer fits the needs of Israel after October 7th. The world has changed radically since then, and the Israeli people are being stifled right now by a governing vision that is stuck in the past. Nobody expects Prime Minister Netanyahu to do the things that must be done to break the cycle of violence, to preserve Israel's credibility on the world stage, and to work towards a two-state solution. If he were to disavow Ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and kick them out of his governing coalition, that would be a real meaningful step forward. But regrettably, there's no reason to believe Prime Minister Netanyahu would do that. He won't disavow Ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir in their calls for Israelis to drive Palestinians out of Gaza and the West Bank. He won't commit to a military operation in Rafah that prioritizes protecting civilian life. He won't engage responsibly in discussions about a day-after plan for Gaza and a longer-term pathway to peace.
Senator Schumer said that after October 7th, we're all in a different place in Israel in terms of what needs to be done for our society, and that Prime Minister Netanyahu simply, he's not up to date. He doesn't have what it takes to get Israel where it needs to go. Israel needs a two-state solution, he said. We need to have a Palestinian state. And Prime Minister Netanyahu and the hardliners that are in his government, particularly Treasury Minister Bezalel Smotrich and National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, they're just, they're too fanatical. They're just not going to do it. They won't do what needs to be done in order to get to a Palestinian state. And therefore, Netanyahu, who's siding with them, he has to go. What's interesting about what he said is that 2 weeks ago, Israel's so-called premier national security think tank, the Institute for National Security Studies, had their annual conference that was in part sponsored by the U.S. Embassy here in Israel. And the INSS is sort of the meeting ground or the post IDF nesting grounds for all of Israel's retired senior military brass. It's led today by retired Major General Tamir Hyman, who until a couple of years ago was the head of Israel military intelligence in the IDF. And his predecessor, Amos Yadlin, was another former head of IDF military intelligence. We remember, of course, the military intelligence is the primary body responsible for Israel's failure to heed the warnings that we had before October 7th that Hamas was about to carry out an invasion of Israel. Lower-level intelligence officers had received Hamas's detailed plans, and the head of the intelligence directorate, Aaron Khaliwa, just ignored them and insisted in every forum that Hamas was completely deterred, and we were looking at 5 years of quiet and peace from Gaza. All we needed to do is continue getting the Qatari money flowing into Gaza, give them money, let them work in Israel, and everything would be fine. And in the event, of course, he was completely wrong. And the plans that lower-level NCOs had intercepted from Hamas, giving the details of the October 7th invasion, were absolutely correct and accurate. And what they portrayed in those plans is precisely what Hamas did in terms of their invasion of Israel with a division-level strength, the conduct of mass slaughter, kidnapping. They didn't foresee the rape, but that as well is a component part of Hamas's plans. And we had almost all of it in our hands over a year before it happened. And our intelligence leadership refused to heed the warnings, ignored them, and went with their concept that all we needed was to have quiet, was to pay off Hamas with Qatari money and with jobs in Israel. So that was them, and his predecessor, Tamir Hyman, also shared that view of Hamas. At any rate, at their annual conference 2 weeks ago, all of the speakers, it was sort of amazing, every single one of them, or at least every single one of the major speakers at the conference, all gave speeches that were aligned with the Biden administration strategy for handling the war with Hamas. Obviously from Israel, with an Israeli gloss on it, but basically what they all said was that in the day after, Israel needed to enable the Palestinian Authority to take over Gaza. We did last in focus on the Palestinian Authority security forces and the Regavim report that showed that that the Palestinian Authority security services, much as our intelligence geniuses from the IDF don't want to admit it, that it's actually a terrorist organization over the past 3 years by their own admission, the admission of the Palestinian Authority security forces. 78 members of their security services have participated in terrorist attacks against Israeli civilians and soldiers. And again, the last one that we know of was on February 29th, when you had a Palestinian officer from the U.S.-funded and trained and armed Palestinian Authority security forces carried out the terrorist attack at the gas station outside of the town of Eli in the Benjamin district, where he murdered 2 Israeli civilians, one a 53-year-old rabbi, and the second one is a 16-year-old teenage boy. And so they want these Palestinian Authority security forces to take over Gaza after the war, which is very much in alignment with the American position, which is that the Palestinian Authority has to take over Gaza. The other thing that they said is that the end of the war should be normalization of relations between Israel and the Saudi Arabians, and the way to bring that about is for Israel to agree to support the establishment of a Palestinian state in Judea and Samaria and in Gaza. So these are all the positions that are taken by the Biden administration, but notably, these are positions that are rejected, aside from, of course, normalization with Saudi Arabia, who's opposed to that. But the idea of the security forces of the Palestinian Authority taking over Gaza after the war is opposed by nearly 90% of Israelis, according to multiple opinion poll surveys that show that Israelis don't support and do not trust the Palestinian Authority, specifically because of its support for Hamas. 85% of Palestinians support the October 7th attack against Israel, the invasion of Israel. Israelis oppose the Palestinian Authority takeover of Gaza after the war, and 75% of Israelis oppose Palestinian statehood. If you poll Israeli Jews, it's even higher. So you have the security brass, as you know, we see from INSS, which is where they all work after they leave the army. They're all in complete alignment with the American position of the Biden administration, which stands in opposition of the position not only of the government of Israel, but of upwards of 3/4 of Israelis. And by the way, the other interesting thing about it is that a number of the speakers at the INS conference 2 weeks ago also said that Netanyahu has to be ousted from government in order for us to get to the promised land, the place where we all want to be, which is a Palestinian state. Notably, one of the people who said it was Nadav Argaman, who is the former head of the Shin Bet, Israel Security Service. And he said that Netanyahu had to be ousted in order for us to get to where we want to go. He also said that, the Palestinian Authority is totally anti-terror, all evidence to the contrary, which is really troubling, given that the Shin Bet is responsible for fighting Palestinian terrorism. But whatever. So that's part of the alignment of this Israeli elite with the United States and against the position of the overwhelming majority of Israelis. And I think it's very important. And then the other thing that I think is important is that, here in the soundbite that we just showed of Schumer, he talked about how, the government was deeply controversial before October 7th because of the reforms that it wanted to enact in the Israeli judiciary, which he claims were problematic from a perspective of democracy. The guy who wants to oust the duly elected prime minister of Israel and overthrow the government, he thinks that government is anti-democratic, but whatever. And I think that here I just wanted to switch for a second to something really unbelievable that I heard yesterday, which is the recording of a podcast, and I want to play you a couple of excerpts from it, that I guess was broadcast or whatever, launched a couple of days ago. It was a podcast by Dan Senor, who is leading American Jewish public figure. He was a senior official in the Bush administration, and he has this podcast, and he interviewed a former member of Knesset from Ehud Barak's Independence Party. It was the Labor Party, and then they sort of branched off from the Labor Party. Anyway, they were in Netanyahu's governing coalition from, I think, 2009 to 2011, it was from 2009 to 2013, on and off. Ehud Barak joined Netanyahu's coalition. He served as defense minister, and Einat Wilf was a member of Ehud Barak's faction that broke off from the Labor Party when he joined Netanyahu's coalition. Anyway, Einat Wilf, she's a PhD, and she is considered an intellectual. And, she's liked actually by some people on the right because she wrote a book that exposed the fact that UNRWA, the UN group that acts as the political arm of Hamas in Gaza, as we've seen in this war, she said that UNRWA, it was written a couple of years ago, that UNRWA is a devastating institution in the area, that it's prolonging the Palestinian rejection of Israel through its education system, etc. So that was a very sort of non-left-wing thing to do, acknowledge the fact that there are forces inside of Palestinian society and also in the international community that actually want to, the UN system, that want to prolong the Palestinian conflict, that are preaching anti-Semitism and genocide of Jews. So that was very helpful, and so she's sort of considered a centrist. But really, she never really expressed any centrist views because her ultimate objective is to expel all the Jews from Judea and Samaria. She's willing to divide Jerusalem and everything else. So she gave this podcast, or this interview on Dan Senor's podcast, that was that was sort of highlighted by my friend and colleague, and he's been a guest on the show, and it actually initially was my co-host on the show, Gadi Taub, because of what she talked about in this podcast, and openly and in English and everything else. And and it speaks to Schumer's claim that Netanyahu's effort to reform the judiciary in Israel was somehow or another causing harm to Israel's democracy. And I just want to play you a couple of clips from her so that we can get a real, first-person admission from somebody on the left who participated in the anti-government demonstrations and is very much part of that milieu, what she had to say about the nature of the protest against judicial reform.
Before October 7th, if I were to ask most Israelis of the left and the center, and even some actually on the center right, what their defining issue was, it was the judicial reform fight. It was the fight for Israeli democracy. And that issue had almost, I don't want to say replaced, but it subordinated the two-state solution issue for a variety of reasons, not the least of which you described, the post-Camp David second Intifada experience, and that the central organizing issue was strengthening, as they would say it, strengthening Israeli democracy and beating back at least parts of the religious right within Israel, limiting their political reach. Where does that issue now stand post-October 7th? Because that dynamic was in the works pre-October 7th.
So given that I think that issue was always just a proxy issue, I can say this. The official issue is really not a central issue right now. Judicial reform and all that, I mean, very few people still talk about it. But I actually never thought that in itself is a real issue. And I just thought that the intensity of feelings that we saw around it was not about how to nominate judges. The intensity of feelings, I thought, had to do with who governs Israel and who gets to govern Israel. And my analysis during that whole period was that the judicial reform was really a proxy issue for who gets to govern Israel, and that those who were in the streets calling for, democracy and defending the Israeli Supreme Court were actually there for a far deeper reason, which I do think borne itself out, that an extreme right-wing government just cannot govern the state of Israel, period. And that those are people who are just not legit. I mean, they may have official democratic legitimacy, they might have the numbers, they might have won the elections, but they don't have deep legitimacy.
Okay, so she says it was all a lie. This was not about democracy. The whole judicial reform thing was a proxy issue, right? That it was there because they were really mad because the right won the elections, and the left in Israel does not believe that the right has a right to govern. It's not legitimate. True, they won the election, and from a democratic perspective, they have legitimacy, but they don't have, she said here, you might have the numbers. I mean, they may have official democratic legitimacy, they might have the numbers. Yeah, they do. 64 mandates, right, for judicial reform explicitly. They might have won the elections. They did win the elections again. They got 64 seats out of 120 in the Knesset. That's a mandate to govern by all accounts. But they don't have deep legitimacy. Then she goes on and, she talks about how really you can't reach any determination on military service for ultra-Orthodox Jews because ultra-Orthodox Jews are totally illegitimate and they don't have a right to determine anything about who. The ultra-Orthodox Jews, totally illegitimate, and they don't have a right to say who gets to serve, who gets exempt from military service, nothing. They're like, no, they can't be allowed to have a voice in that debate. Why? Because they're not legitimate. They don't have that deep legitimacy. And then she talks about how she went and she spoke at this conference in Britain. And at this conference in Britain, she heard people refer to the Tories as the natural party of governance, that had been ruling Britain for 90 out of the previous 120 years, and then even with the 30 years that the Labour Party was in charge, 10 of them were with Tony Blair. He was third way. He's really a centrist. He's really half Tory. So that's only 20 out of the last 120 years. So she said, gee, I get that, because the Labor Party, the old guard Labor Party, Mapai, that was the governing party in pre-state Israel, and then for the first 25 years of sovereign Israeli history, they were the natural party of governance, and the Likud is the natural party of the opposition. And then she goes on and she explains that really there were only two pure right-wing governments in Israeli history. The first one was the second Begin government that was elected in 1981, and the second one is the current government. Okay, so she says that in all the other governments that were led by Likud, they all had babysitters. They were parties, breakaway parties or whatever, from the ruling class of Israel that came to be babysitters to protect Israel from the policies of the elected government. And then that's what they did. And that the problem with this government is that it didn't have a babysitter from the left. Okay, so I just want to play you a second clip here. Let's start it from... Oh, and by the way, she called the second Begin government and this government a colossal disaster. And then she said, gotta go. Here, we're going to start it from and during judicial reform. Okay? So she says this. And during judicial reform, let's go to the videotape.
Even when Likud was in power, you always had what I call a labor babysitter. So essentially someone from the natural party of governance who came to babysit those who could not be trusted to govern. And during judicial reform, I think this is what basically happened, that the people in the streets calling for democracy, they were not really calling for democracy. At least that was my interpretation. They were basically saying that with all due respect, you, this right-wing government, this coalition of extreme right-wingers and settlers and Haredis who don't have a skin in the game, you do not get to govern the Jewish state because you don't actually get what it means to govern it. And I think they were right. And by the way, the reason that Gantz rushed into the government after October 7th is the understanding that they cannot be left to govern. It's just irresponsible.
We talked a couple of weeks ago, I think, about how he came to Washington, and the National Security Council's spokesperson, Kirby, said that, well, actually he invited himself. Nobody asked him to come, but we're always happy to hear from our Israeli partners, and therefore we brought him in. So I just want to alert you to something really interesting. Channel 14 on Monday or on Sunday of this week reported something extraordinary that I went back and looked at. There's this post on Twitter. There's a post on Twitter that is taking an internal chat of the leaders of the sort of, you might call it the protest group, the people who were organizing all of the anti-government protests in the 10 months coming up before October 7th. And so they're still together, they're still operating, they're still organizing protests, and what they're saying is that they are, and in this chat, one of the leaders of the protest group, this guy named Amit Dror, I think I've actually spoken about him on the show way before, in the world before October 7th. He says in their web chat, in their WhatsApp chat group, he's giving them information about communications that he's been having with White House officials. Okay, and he said in a later interview with Channel 14 that he has deep contacts inside of the White House.
כשאתה כותב, הבקשה של הנשיא ביידן מאיתנו, איך אתה יודע, כאילו...
אני לא יכול להגיד לך, אבל זה מגיע עמוק בתוך הבית הלבן. אני מכיר הרבה מאוד מהאנשים בממשל האמריקאי, והם מודעים לזה שאני מאוד פעיל חברתי בישראל, ומעבירים לי לפרט, זה לא פעם ראשונה.
So this guy may be a blowhard, and everything that he says may be false. But I think it speaks to the mindset, at a minimum, of the people who are organizing the anti-government demonstrations that they're trying to expand today and make them into mass riots against the government. It speaks, at least at a minimum, to their mindset and how they view themselves in terms of the U.S. administration and how they view the administration as their ally in ousting the government. So this guy, Ami Dror, he writes in a very long set of posts that were exposed, that were reported on by this Israeli Hebrew language Twitter account called Arab Blue, and he brought he brought what Ami Dror said, and there were basically 4 sections of it, and they're all about the Biden administration's plans vis-a-vis overthrowing the Israeli government, and B, how the Biden administration seeks to incorporate the Israeli protest movement to oust Netanyahu from government into what Ami Dror claims that they refer to as a color revolution that will bring about the overthrow of the Israeli government. And so basically he gives 4 different components to what he claims is the Biden administration's effort to overthrow the government, that the last component of which is their efforts to reorganize mass demonstrations against the government to force Netanyahu from power. And so the first component that he lays out, and again, he claims this is all based on direct communications with the White House. And again, this may or may not be true. The guy may be a blowhard. He claimed in a subsequent interview with Channel 14 that it's absolutely true, that he has deep contacts in the White House. So this is what this guy, Ami Dror, said. He said that the first component of the plan is the Biden administration's plan to build a port in Gaza. And we know that President Biden spoke about this plan in the State of the Union address. And he said that the goal of the port thing is to seize control over Gaza from the IDF, just to make the IDF lose control. So we saw the beginning of that with the parachuting in of MREs, of meals ready to eat, from U.S. aircraft into Gaza. We had the same thing with Jordan, and it's not clear the level of coordination that the U.S. is carrying out with Israel prior to these drops of meals ready to eat. And, there were reports that 5 people in Gaza were killed when they were hit by MREs or something falling from the sky. I don't know. But the point is that part of it is to make Israel lose control of the humanitarian situation in Gaza, to cause chaos, and to make Israel just sort of raise its hands and say, I don't know what to do anymore because we've lost control of the situation. And the other thing is that they want this port in order to bring in building materials, because what we really need to do is rebuild Gaza. Because we know that none of that concrete for building buildings is going to be diverted, God forbid, to build another 500 miles of underground terror tunnels. No, of course. So he claims that that's the purpose of the port. It's to make Israel lose control of Gaza and to rebuild Gaza. The second thing he says, he's talking about the hostage deal. So today, Israeli negotiators are flying to Qatar for another round of negotiations in Doha, the capital of Hamas in the Arabian Peninsula. And they're meeting with Qatari negotiators and U.S. negotiators and whatever, Egyptian, to try to get to a deal. And so what Ami Dror claims is that the hostage deal, the purpose of the hostages, this isn't a humanitarian issue from the American perspective, he claims. It's instrumental to ousting Netanyahu. So the hostage deal that they intend to force Israel to accept is one that will bring about the end of the war without victory, meaning an Israeli loss, and that will destroy Netanyahu's governing coalition, because because 2 things will happen. One, the 2 sort of ideologically right-wing parties in the governing coalition that are led, the religious Zionist party led by Treasury Minister Smotrich and the Jewish Power Party, led by Itamar Ben-Gvir, will leave because they wouldn't want to risk the support of their voters if they stayed in with this kind of a deal. And then either Israel would go to new elections, or Benny Gantz and Gideon Sa'ar and Yair Lapid, Avigdor Lieberman, all of these members of the left-wing bloc will join him and force him to accept the American positions on the war that, again, are antithetical to the positions as stated by 3/4 and up of Israelis who do not want a Palestinian state and don't want the Palestinian Authority in charge, but we have all of these retired generals supporting. And so the hostage deal is a way to force Netanyahu to transfer power essentially to the left that will do the bidding of the United States. And if he doesn't do that, Amidor wrote in this WhatsApp group, then the United States is going to pass a UN Security Council resolution that is going to compel Israel to lose the war, to not operate in Rafah, to have a ceasefire, etc. So that the United States is either going to use the UN Security Council, or they'll simply use the hostage deal to oust Netanyahu from power, one way or another. The third thing that he said is that they're using what he referred to as economic violence against ministers. And here the concept is that sort of in wait, we have the International Court of Justice that's supposedly adjudicating this ludicrous claim that Israel is committing genocide, when of course it's Hamas, but whatever. And so that's one aspect of it. And the other aspect of it is the International Criminal Court. So the International Criminal Court, the United States is a member, but all of these European nations are. And today, Monday, we had Joseph Borrell, who's the EU foreign minister, who's accusing Israel of deliberately starving the people of Gaza, which is just an utter lie. But what's the point of this kind of lie? Again, it's instrumental. It's in order to gain something. And the thing that it gains is the ability to charge Israeli ministers with war crimes. Because if you're deliberately starving a population, then you're committing a war crime. And so if the EU foreign minister is accusing Israel of war crimes, then that gives legitimacy to an international criminal court prosecution of Israelis for war crimes. And the idea, according to Amidor, who claims that he has, said again, he claims. So this may just be him, and I wouldn't put it past him to just make these claims without any real connection to the administration. But he says that the idea here is to extort concessions from members of the cabinet who don't want to be charged with war crimes, who don't want their accounts frozen, and he names specific ministers. Whatever, I'm not going to go through it, but that he believes that that he claims the Americans believe, but he certainly believes are susceptible to extortion and threats of having their bank accounts seized. And then there's actually 5 things. The fourth thing is Benny Gantz. So he alleges that Benny Gantz was actually summoned to Washington, contrary to what Kirby said, because he was dressed down, that the administration had expected Gantz to come into the government and then leave after a few weeks and bring down the government. Or at a minimum, initially it was supposed to be like 6 weeks, and then it was January. And now it's a hostage deal, and they demand that he leave and destabilize the government and overthrow the government, etc., go to new elections. And so far, he's failing to do that. They may still support him as prime minister in the future, but he's out of the game of ousting the prime minister. And now Amidor claims that this is just the United States has, the administration has taken full charge. This is their plan, how to do it. And this, he says, is where the anti-government demonstrations come in. So he claims that their job now is to ignite Israel across country with mass demonstrations against the government in order to bring down the government. And so, in the service of a foreign government, in the service of the United States of America. Now, obviously, there are questions here about whether this isn't a criminal enterprise. But, here that they claim to be operating as agents of a foreign power, regardless of how friendly it is, I trust that our Attorney General, who is totally political, won't do anything about it. So we'll just put that aside. But, what's really interesting is that most leftists, again, recognize that those three goals that were laid out by INSS, bringing the Palestinian Authority into Gaza after the war, the Palestinian Authority security forces, which we showed, are essentially a terrorist organization that the United States supports and sponsors. Bring it in. Almost no Israelis support that idea. 3/4 of Israelis do not support, including Arabs, do not support a Palestinian state. And the thing with Saudi Arabia is just sort of, a bait on a hook. And then everybody is for it. I mean, I'm for normalization with Saudi Arabia in theory, but not if it, requires Israel to commit suicide. Okay? So the basic idea here is, this is what the United States wants. This is what these members of the elite want. And that brings me back to Wilf's podcast, because the title, I think, of the podcast is something like The Shattering of the Israeli Left. And she spent the first third of her conversation with Sinor explaining that indeed October 7th was a shattering experience for Israeli leftists, because until then they always thought that the Arabs and the international community, such as it is, drew a distinction between legitimate Israel, which is Israel, she claims, within the 1949 armistice lines, and illegitimate Israel, which is, unified Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, Gaza, etc. And so they assumed that the international community and the Palestinians were with the Israeli left, because the Israeli left was with them in terms of only supporting legitimate Israel. And then came October 7th, and the primary victims of Hamas's invasion force were the Israeli leftists who live in all of the communities along the border with Gaza. Right? They were the primary victims, Israeli leftists from Be'eri, from Nir Oz, from Kfar Aza, from the Nova Festival, which, as she noted, was a peace festival. All of these people that were deliberately targeted, and communities that are deliberately targeted by Hamas, are all communities that are associated really with the far left of Israeli politics. And yet they were the ones who were butchered. So that showed that the Palestinians, and they also referred to them, the Hamas people did, as settlers. We're going into the settlement of Be'eri. We're going after the settlers. And as if, they lived in Judea and Samaria, and here they lived in Be'eri. So that disabused the left of the idea, right, that the Palestinians were drawing a distinction. And then the second thing was that here the international community started going against Zionism, which is supposed to be about legitimate Israel from the perspective of Reinat Wilf and her colleagues. And yet Zionism is another watchword for Jew. And here you have people from all of these otherwise, friendly groups, organizations, governments in the West who are attacking Zionists. And that means that actually the people who the left in Israel thought were in alliance with them were actually not at all. They totally oppose all Israelis, not just the Israeli right, the way that Wilf and her comrades, in the party of governance, view the problem. They don't view the problem as a religious or as the settlers in Judea and Samaria or the ultra Orthodox. Rather, they view the problem as all of Israel, and so the Palestinians view the problem as all of Israel, meaning that she's with the incorrigibles, and the Europeans and the American left, they also view it as all of Israel being a problem and not just the incorrigibles, right? And that was a really shattering experience that Israeli leftists underwent on and since October 7th. Okay, so what's really ironic here, or not ironic, it's stunning, is that, in the normal course of events, you might think, okay, you had this shattering experience, you realized that the great unwashed majority of Israelis who you rail against and refer to as the natural party of the opposition, and that these people have no right to lead the country, right? That they were right all along, and that you were wrong all along. They recognized that the problem wasn't, the communities in Judea and Samaria. It wasn't ultra-Orthodox Jews. It wasn't religious Zionists. It wasn't Sephardic Jews. It wasn't anything. It was that, fundamentally, they, meaning the Arabs, the Palestinians, they, meaning the international left, the international establishment that you want to be the Israeli branch of, they reject Israel's right to exist. All of it. The Israeli elites and the great unwashed. They hate everybody. They don't think that Israel has a right to exist. And Joseph Borrell, who's accusing Israel of the war crime of deliberately starving Palestinians, which is self-evidently a lie, he's not doing it because he hates Itamar Ben-Gvir, or even if he hates Benjamin Netanyahu. He hates Israel. That's why he would be expressing such a blood libel, such a slander against the Jewish state, as what he did. When the people being deliberately starved are, of course, the hostages who are given a pita or half a pita a day and denied medical treatment, and, of course, Red Cross visits, whatever. But that's not who he's accusing. The people he's accusing are innocent Israelis. So, it's weird then when you see that, when you understand the shattering experience that the left underwent on and since October 7th, that all the same, you see all of these members of the elite among the Israeli retired generals corps at INSS, and of course the protesters against the government today, they're continuing on with this partnership, even though it's self-evidently a one-sided partnership. And I think that here you see that what we have is kind of a conjoining of forces that are hostile to an Israeli victory, that are trying to corral Israel into a position where we have no choice but to lose by destabilizing our government, by ousting a prime minister, or forcing him to change the composition of his coalition to give the governing power to his political nemesis, and to essentially surrender control over Israel's national policy to people who want a policy that the United States government is advancing against the wishes of upwards of 3/4 of Israelis. So why would they do this? What would be the impetus for them to do what they're doing? And I think that here, what's really amazing, and that comes through very clearly in Wolf's sardonic laughter when she talks about the majority of Israelis, is this prejudice. It's this incredible prejudice. They may have official democratic legitimacy. They might have the numbers. They might have won the elections, but they don't have deep legitimacy. What is deep legitimacy? She rejects the right of the majority of the Israeli people to control the government. So out of this sense of entitlement, this incredible sense of entitlement, you have these elites who are pushing for a political outcome that will bring about, as Prime Minister Netanyahu said, Israel's defeat in war. If we go to elections, that means 6 months of paralysis. That means that we lose the war. And if we lose the war, we're placed in existential danger. Because Israel not defeating Hamas, the implications of that is that Hamas wins, and then that's an invitation for mass aggression from all fronts, from the north with Hezbollah, from the east from Iran's proxy forces in Iraq and in Syria, and from the south from the Houthis, and from further east from Iran, which is, planning to just waltz across the nuclear threshold thanks to another $10 billion in sanctions waivers from President Biden. So I think, it's a very horrible sort of system that we find ourselves in. And I guess our two things are very important. One is that at the end of the day, the public will out, just as Netanyahu won the elections with his great unwashed coalition of people who are unworthy, according to Einat Wolf and her friends. 75% of Israelis opposing Palestinian statehood is that nothing. Israelis are used to freedom and determining our own path, and I just don't. And I don't think that, I don't think it's going to work. But Schumer came under tremendous attack after he made this statement, after he made this speech from all quarters, even from Joe Lieberman, even Senator Ben Cardin, who is his ally in the Senate. He did not stand by what Schumer said because it was wrong. And so, I think that the fact that not only do the overwhelming majority of Israelis oppose this, but also the overwhelming majority of Americans support Israeli victory in the war. So I believe that, once alerted to the problem, we're already seeing a reaction with rising support levels for Prime Minister Netanyahu. And I think we'll continue to see that sort of reaction in Israel and likely in the United States as well. So those are my thoughts for today about, the sort of wider picture of what we're seeing when we're looking at an open effort by the administration to oust the democratically elected government of Israel from power. I'll talk to you later about this and other issues coming up as the week progresses.